Welcome back to Beyond the Helmet. And of course, that's hashtag BTHpod if you're following on social media. I'm Steve McGrath, and today I have a very special guest. It's not just someone that played 12 years of professional football and was an All-American offensive lineman at Nebraska. It's someone that has gone through an actual struggle and came out the other side better. It's Bob Newton, someone who has spent at least 3 full decades now working to help individuals, but definitely athletes, work through substance abuse. Bob, I thank you so much for taking the time. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be with you, and grateful that you're interested in an old offensive lineman from the NFL, and so it's great to be with you today.
Hey, Ed White, Jerry Shirk, I'm so thrilled that I get to keep the train rolling with men that have played in an era that, we don't really talk about 70s football players that much. So it's great to be able to talk a little bit about the glory days, but most importantly, how do you live a fruitful, successful life after that first career is over?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, the last 3 decades, I had a severe problem with alcoholism through my whole NFL career, but each year it progressed, it got worse. And by the time of my 12th year, when I went to training camp with the Seahawks, I was in a fairly late stage of alcoholism, and my playing performance had been really affected. I wasn't playing up to my expectations, and so when the Seahawks, they let me go, and then that was in September of 1982, and then in July of 1983, I entered a rehabilitation center in Monroe, Washington for addiction treatment. And I had a couple of stints with the USFL in between that time, and my drinking interfered there with me, and I was with the Boston Breakers and the Chicago Blitz, and George Allen had to let me go from the Blitz. He was the head coach at that time, and Dick Corey was the head coach of the Boston Breakers, and they both knew I had a severe alcohol problem, but there wasn't a lot of protocols at that time to get help, and I was still in a lot of denial. So I finally, my denial really broke in July of 1983. I entered that treatment center and got treated for my addiction. It was life-saving.
I'm sure. Do you mind detailing at all, to the point where you're no longer able to perform on the field? What does a typical day or week look like for someone that was as alcohol dependent as yourself?
Well, I'd go to practice hungover. I would sometimes drink till late into the night, and I wouldn't get good sleep. And then I'd go out there and I practice hungover. Now, when I was young, when I was in my early 20s and mid 20s, and I could recover a little bit better, and I could get through practice and work hard and so forth. But as I got older, especially when I got into my early 30s, that recovering from those drinking and other drug episodes were much harder. And it was just impacting my performance. And I look at pictures when I was a rookie, I was about 260. And then I look at pictures of me in my 11th and 12th year. My face looks gaunt. I'm weighing 252. It was taking an impact on my physical conditioning, and it was just a progressive nature that just
Sure.
kept progressing each year.
So when you think about, 71, your rookie year, does that look like maybe it's just partying too hard after a game? Was it mostly maybe the off season, and then in season you were a little more regimented? I'm just curious how it progresses. What was the baseline as a rookie for 12 years later to really have it?
Yeah, that's a good question. The NFL was a pretty highly drinking environment. So as a rookie, when I went in there, I mean, I hung out with some of the veterans, but I could drink. Now, I should give you some background history, just a little bit. I come from a family where there was significant alcoholism on both sides. And I'm a firm believer that there is a genetic predisposition to developing alcoholism and other drug addiction problems, especially if you come from that kind of family. So I'd been a heavy drinker coming into my rookie year with the Bears. But I didn't stand out a lot from other people. I had a high tolerance for alcohol. I could drink a lot, and I didn't drink every day, and I didn't drink in the mornings and stuff like that. It was mostly weekends after practice, a little bit, so forth. So I was kind of it was kind of moderately in control in my early 20s. But again, as I got older, it just got more and more out of control, and the deterioration progressed.
Sure. So I had read this, so I hope this is accurate, and if not, please correct me. But at some point in high school to college, I believe you had said at one point that you had also experimented with marijuana, and while in the NFL, you embraced, amphetamines on game day, which of course, as an upper, is something that would, have the opposite effect as a depressant like alcohol.
Exactly.
When you think about, I know we've talked so far specifically about alcohol, but of course this falls under substance abuse. When you think about the use of amphetamines, was that to counteract what you were doing with alcohol, like get an upper to offset the downer, or does this just fall under um, the addicted personality of this was just an addiction, almost the same as it was any alcohol or drug you could get your hands on?
Yeah, that's a good point about being chemically dependent to drugs I got introduced to. I was a lot more susceptible to that. But the amphetamine use started uh, earlier than even when I didn't use amphetamines. I used a little bit towards the end of my high school uh, graduation piece, but in the early 70s and in the 60s, amphetamine use in the NFL was pretty common. And they finally got a handle on it in, I think, 72, 71, where it was very, very watched that players were not using amphetamines. But up to then, it was a pretty regular, it was not by all players, but some players. And uh, I don't think I did, I usually up until later on, I didn't drink 2 or 3 days before a game. I wouldn't drink. I would drink on Sundays and Mondays, and then the rest of the week I'd lay off. So I'd go into the game in good condition. And of course, now that slacked a little bit as I progressed and I got late into my later years. But the amphetamine was, so I used it my first 2 years in Chicago, off and on, not every game, uh, but but then I terminated it because it was outlawed. But I was introduced to cocaine around 1973 or 1974 in Chicago, and it was just starting to get popular in the early 70s. And I was at a party in a high rise in Chicago, and a couple of people said, "Hey, Bob, you want to try this? It's cocaine. It's a social drug, something like that." I said, great. I'd like to be social. Yeah, I'll have some. So uh, I was introduced to cocaine that night, and I ended up developing, as time went on, I ended up developing a late stage dependency to cocaine too. Now, I didn't freebase cocaine. Freebase was kind of popular at that time towards the late 70s. I just snorted it. So, but I didn't think I was a drug addict because, I wasn't using a needle and I wasn't freebasing and I wasn't an alcoholic because I wasn't on Skid Row. And I had all these denial excuses and rationalizations that, I'm just a party guy and I like to have a lot of fun. I didn't recognize the symptoms.
Now, and I want to stress something that you've already said. We are talking about the 70s. So to have this conversation in 2021, it's, I just want to stress how different the times were then. So you can't
Sure.
look at it with social norms and rules today versus what it was like then. It's just two different time periods.
You bet.
But that being said, today, obviously, not just the NFL, but society is very different. NFL certainly very stringent on testing. I'm aware that they even have a service that if a player had been out drinking, they will come valet you, that they'll pick you up, they'll get you home. There's literally no excuse to ever be drinking and driving in today's NFL.
Right.
When you think about how different the landscape is, I, do you think that it's come far enough to support players that because obviously the average plumber person that has any sort of dependency issue, that level of support may not be there, but do you think that the professional organization of the NFL and the teams does enough today to help guys that may have been in your shoes to help sort of find that personality trait earlier and even help treat it?
I think they've come a long ways. I think they put some programming into each organization that's available to help players. Uh, Back in my day in the 70s, and when we would have our training camps, there would be a NFL New York representative come out and speak to us on one night at one of our team meetings. And basically it was like, don't hang out with drug dealers, stay away from gamblers. Uh, rarely was alcohol even mentioned, but it was like, just stay away from those bad people and don't be in the wrong places at the right time. So I already had a problem. I mean, I knew that I didn't know, but I mean, there were symptoms that I already had a problem. So I think it's more now when they do those talks, I think we have help for you if you think you have a problem. Come and talk to us and we'll do an assessment and make some recommendations and get you some help, or come voluntarily and you need help, we'll get some help for you. And they have services for former players too now, through the NFL Players Association and Union, for us to get help for mental health issues or addiction issues. So they've come a long ways.
As you said, a big part of that is the player seeking it out and being willing to accept it. So if I could go back to your story, do you do you recall feeling in I'm sorry, I forget if it was 82 or 83. Um, did you actually have that moment where you said, I have a problem, I'm willing to get help? Yeah. Do you actually have that? I don't want to call it a rock bottom. I don't know if it necessarily was for you, but do you have that moment of clarity?
Yeah, I did. And one of the stages that a person that has a problem with alcohol or other drugs is to get through the denial stage. And usually people start looking at their behavior when they really start suffering multiple consequences that are directly related to their alcohol and other drug use. And it could be a DUI, it could be relationship issues, employment issues, medical issues. So a lot of people don't really usually wake up in Southern California here and say, what a beautiful day, I'm going to go check into the Betty Ford Center. you know, People usually come into treatment through external motivation. People have recognized they have a problem and they need help. And if they want to keep their job, you need to go get treated. If you want to stay married to me, you need to go get help. Those types of external motivations usually get people into treatment. And you'll see the family interventions are very helpful too to help someone get into treatment. Because the alcoholic and drug addict, they're usually the last people to know how bad it's getting. They have learned to just, when they do have a consequence, they don't take time out and say, well, that's directly related to my alcohol or other drug use. Usually they have this excuse system built in. Well, if this wouldn't have happened, then that wouldn't have happened, and I wouldn't have drank like that, and if I had a better wife, and if I had a better job. So have that denial system has to be addressed while they're in treatment. And no, and I used to tell patients when I counseled for 25 years, I don't care how you come in the treatment. What I care about is how you leave, and that external motivation is converted into an internal motivation. Okay, you came in here because of your wife or your job or your doctor, but now you're leaving and you want to stay sober for yourself. And when people experience that transition, it's, they take responsibility and on a daily basis to stay sober.
Absolutely. I mean, for anything to sustain itself, it has to be internally driven and motivated. It's going to fail if it's just that sort of external noise.
Exactly.
Is there anything that you found in your, 25 years as a counselor that was maybe your most go-to way of sort of piercing into someone's brain that they had to do that? I mean, is there anything that you could, fairly easily, relay in just a conversation about what you found to be the most potent way to connect with people that were stuck in that denial phase?
Well, I was a pretty basic guy, and that every client I worked with, I would educate them on the denial system and how it worked and how it keeps people blocked. And I would go through each phase of that denial system, the excuse making, the rationalization, minimizing, and so forth. Because if that denial system is not addressed, they can't get to the other stages, which is, you mentioned, like, I'm just putting in time right now, and it's not an internal process yet. We call that compliance. They're just doing the deal. They can't wait till their 30th or 60th day, and then they're out of here. They don't get to the stage of acceptance, where they start accepting that they do have a problem, unless that denial stage is addressed. And then the last stage we talk about is actually surrendering. And when I first heard that word, I go, look, I hate that word. I'm a professional athlete. I don't surrender anything. Okay. And my counselor said to me, I loved him to death. His name was Don Anderson, and he had like 50 years of sobriety when he passed away a few years ago. But he said, Bob, he goes, well, you're a competitor, right? I go, yeah. He says, well, you've been getting your butt kicked a lot here in the last several years from alcohol and other drugs. You want to keep going through that? And I said, no. So I found that word surrendering to be a very strong word in my vocabulary for me to stay clean and sober. I've had it since day one when I learned that word in treatment, and I've kept it close to my tools.
Yeah, I can imagine that surrender means defeat in most
Yeah,
driven,
yeah,
particularly competitive people. Like that's a non-starter. Like that's an immediate nope, can't do that.
yeah,
That's not the
yeah.
way I'm wired.
Well, yeah. See, the cunning part about alcohol and other drugs is that, you always think you're in control. Well, next time I won't drink that much. Well, next time I won't use that much. And then there is a next time. And then so they teach us how to we learn how to stay away from the first drink in the first drug. I always thought it was the third or fourth drink of alcohol that got me in trouble. They taught me it's always the first one. If I learn, that's what recovery's a major part of it, is how do I stay away from that first drink and first drug? How do I defend myself from that? Because if I, like, even today, I've been sober over 38 years. Even today, if I take that first drink or drug, my compulsion's going to return. It's going to be triggered by that first drink. It's a real cunning, baffling, powerful disease, and it starts from that first drink and first drug. And so I've just learned how to defend myself from that in my daily life.
And God bless you for not just learning it, but helping to solve the problem of it being just a societal issue that we as people have, and helping anyone that's afflicted with it, learn to cope with it. So when I talked to Jerry Shirk, he was very, left football. You had an injury, but, left football and had time to think about what he wanted to do. And he has this, he talks about Joseph Campbell and A Hero's Journey.
Yeah.
When I don't know if you've had a chance to hear him speak about that at any point, but does
Yep.
any of that resonate with you? Because your story almost feels like the way that your football career ended with you going, deciding that you wanted to seek help and then following down that line. It almost is like there wasn't necessarily a thought about what you would do. It just sort of, once you went through the rehab, you said, this is me. I'm going to stick with this and I'm going to help people.
That's a good question because, a lot of players have real difficulty transitioning from NFL to regular work life. And nowadays they have a lot more finances supporting them where that the transition is not as crucial. But in our days, we had to go back to work. And what happened to me in treatment is I developed a real passion because I was so grateful that I was learning about alcoholism and other drug addictions that was impacting my personal life and my relationships and my quality of life. And that I I I remember the day it happened, I just started realizing that there's a lot of ignorance in our society about what addiction is and what recovery is. So that passion started, and you can't play in the NFL without passion for football. And I had a deep passion for football all those years, and that passion kind of transitioned into my work. And a lot of my front end work for 4 or 5 years was going into junior high schools and colleges and working with coaches and teachers and administrators and training them how to help young people with a substance use problem in the schools. And I really enjoyed that. And I felt if I went to a school, if one kid was helped, that was great. And then I transitioned more into over the years, a primary counselor. And that's what I did mostly at the Biddy Ford Center.
And I believe you also, you had,
But it was the passion. It was the passion that motivated me.
sure, sure. I mean, I think going through the story that you went through, I don't think anyone could question that it's a passion that fueled you. But I thought I also saw that you had worked with the Seahawks as well in terms of what they were doing as an organization to help support players. And this may be back now in the 80s. How receptive was, if not the NFL, the Seahawks organization to receiving input from someone that had gone through, your life story and try to do something as a team now to help others?
Yeah, that was around, I think I was with the Seahawks. I started with the Seahawks in 1995. I think it's 1994 or
Oh, okay.
1995. And I think I had about 10 years of sobriety at that time. And there had been some stories written about my recovery in Seattle, some of the work I was doing. And then the Seahawks, David Baring was the owner of the team at that time. He bought it from the Nordstrom family. And they started having a few difficulties with the Seahawks with alcohol problems, and they made an organizational decision to bring in some educational awareness and to the players and to the administration. So I think I had 3 or 4 sessions where all the staff were educated about the definition of alcoholism, the signs and the symptoms, how can you respond, where to go get help. So I commended the Seahawks on that they took that proactive approach and to try to prevent any more problems with alcohol and other drugs that could affect the organization. So yeah, that was very gratifying coming back after being cut from the Seahawks in '82 and then coming back 12 years later or 10 years later as a person in recovery and helping others. You know.
It's funny to mention Jerry Shirk again in A Hero's Journey, to kind of see you come full circle there back to the organization to give back. That's spiritually, that has to really move you to be able to come back in that fashion. And that it's not just a sense of closure for the playing career, but also how you're able to give back and help.
Yeah, I've had so many miraculous experiences these last 38 years, Steve. I've seen people get clean and sober that they were, their lives have been so affected by their drinking and using in their marriages and stuff. And I've seen a lot of families healed. I've seen a lot of families, alcohol and other drugs are very powerful, and they take families away and jobs. And I've seen that side of it too. But the gratifying piece is seeing families get well and relationships get better, people get back to work. I was really honored to work with Mrs. Ford for the Betty Ford Center my last 15 years. I felt she was just she was a lady that I think really helped our society with more awareness and with her own personal recovery uh, uh, personal experience that she had to go through treatment. She was very open about that. She wrote a book about it, and I just think she really helped our society become more aware when she opened the Betty Ford Center in 1983.
I mean, how often does someone's name become synonymous with a certain thing, right? If like athletes are one thing, but I mean, if when you hear the name Betty Ford, you know what that is. I mean, the way that she left a mark is undeniable.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't get to know Mrs. Ford real well, but I met her at functions that we had, and Mr. Ford, President Ford. They were great people. They always served us food on Labor Day. They'd come down there and cook and barbecue, serve all the employees. So it was a great experience. And the Betty Ford Center, like I said, they helped a lot of people. A lot of high functioning people would come in there to get help.
Oh, certainly. I don't think that addiction issues are. I don't think that they're prejudiced, right? I don't think that they're sexist or racist. I think that it's a pretty even distribution that amongst the population that certainly anyone is capable of falling.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
No,
And
sorry.
and people that are really really successful, like athletes and actors and uh, physicians and attorneys and so forth, for them to get there, they had to have a good ego, a big ego. And sometimes that that ego needs to be downsized when they come into treatment and get some humility. And I always explain humility as being teachable. Can I learn a new way to live because this way I'm living now is not working anymore? And I need to keep an open mind to that humility and be teachable.
Sure. I think that's key to anyone's personal growth, regardless if you're coming in because you need help or you're just doing well and you want to get better. You
Yeah,
have to be open to coaching.
yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Uh, i- and to look at your football career as someone that was an All-American in college, have a long football career, your addiction aside, you had to be a really good athlete, someone that put in the time, that wasn't just gifted, but worked at your craft. I feel like for most men that go through this transition of being a former athlete to transitioning to another career, there's a lot that you take with you as an athlete. You were so passion driven that I don't necessarily know if it's as applicable to your story, but did you feel like there were certain things you took from being a pro athlete that
Oh,
really helped you be successful?
oh, absolutely. First of all, you mentioned a little while ago about being coachable. I am so grateful that when I went into treatment, I've had some patients come in, high profile patients or high functioning, any type of patient come in and start trying to change the schedule of the program, that we should be doing this, and they're kind of trying to run the place, and they've been there 3 days. Okay, so uh,
Humility.
yeah, there you go. So, what I would usually tell them, I say, you might have some good recommendations, but you need to be sober 2 years before we will look at those recommendations. So, anyway, I would have some fun with it. But being coachable, I took that away from my football experience, and I kind of saw my counselor when I was in counselor as my coach, and he made these recommendations. If you do this, Bob, you're going to stay sober, you're going to have a better life, and so forth. And I followed those recommendations, just like being on the field of practice. And I've got my line coach saying, you ought to step with this foot, push off with this foot and get your hands where they're, I listened. I tried to listen, and I wanted to be coachable. So that transition from the NFL football to my sober life, being coachable was a major, major asset that helped me.
And if we're going to talk about being coachable and your coaches, I have to ask about Coach Devaney at
Yeah.
Nebraska, and of course, Coach Osborne is there as well. Um, Coach Osborne was certainly ahead of his time with how he was able to build a program like that, and that's taking nothing away from Coach Devaney. But when you think back at just being a young man, I'd imagine that you're most impressionable then. Do you remember anything specific about going to Nebraska, coming in as a community college transfer guy? Was there anything in those sort of formidable football years for you that really helped you, either just as a person or as an athlete, that you can really reflect back on?
Well, I tell you, both those coaches were very solid men, and I had the deepest respect for them and admiration. And I wasn't an easy guy to coach at times, I mean, my behavior and stuff. Uh, I- but because, when you're 18, 19, 20, you're still pretty wild and off the field and so forth. But Coach Devaney, I'll never forget one day. When I first went back there from my transfer from junior college, I was on third or fourth string in spring ball, and I didn't think I was going to. When I left spring ball that spring, I said, I'm going to transfer, man. I'm never going to be able to work my way up. But before that happened, the last week of spring ball, I think Coach Devaney could tell I was a little down because I was learning a whole new system. It was very different from where I came from, and the offensive system and so forth. And he goes, listen, Bob. And I was complaining to him. I said, look, I got all these guys in front of me, and I was complaining about, he goes, listen, Bob, all I want you to think about is you getting better. Don't worry about who's in front of you or who's on alongside of you. You just worry about you getting better every day and leave it at that. And I tell you, it, I never forgot that talk because I was worrying too much about everything else in front of me. And I started doing that. I just started working harder, and getting in the weight room. In that summer, I worked hard, and I just kept working on me, and making me better, not worrying about who's in front of me. And then went to fall camp, and by fall camp, I worked myself up to second team, and by the fourth game, they moved me to first team. But that little conversation had the most impact on me, as far as I quit worrying about all the surroundings, and I just started getting better. And I think that's a great principle in life, in any organization.
Of course. And I can't help myself. I have a couple of iron sharpening iron type of questions.
Yeah.
You being on the Chicago Bears at a time where Gale Sayers is there, even if it's not him at his peak, but Dick Butkus, of course, there. You get a chance to be with Walter Payton his rookie season. Um, the Seahawks in the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, we have Steve Largent, of course, Jim Zorn throwing him the ball.
Sure.
Carl Eller there for a year, as
Yeah.
we had mentioned earlier before the show started, but even Keith Butler, who of course is a great defensive coordinator today, but a very good player as well.
You bet.
When you're playing alongside any of these guys, and I know you're, as you just alluded to, focus on yourself, get better every day. Did
Yeah.
you take anything away from what some of your teammates were doing, guys that are generally considered to be, very great players? Was there ever anything that sort of you were able to take here and there from teammates?
Work habits. All three of those guys. Before Gail, I was with Gail Sears his last year in '71, and I think he retired like in the mid-season or something. He was really hobbling, and he just couldn't. His knee was too bad. But all three of those guys had great work habits, uh, and in practice, not just in the weight room and everything, but in practice. And you could see it transitioned over to the field. Dick Butkus was I mean, he was just a ferocious linebacker that intimidated. He's the only player I knew in all the years I was in the NFL that intimidated everybody on the field. He intimidated the opponents. He intimidated his teammates. He intimidated the coaches, the referees. I mean, that's the stature he had, and he gained that stature he was a very physical. He was about 6'3", 245, middle linebacker, and he could tackle, and he tackled with violence. I mean, people. He said it once, I think, in one of his books. He goes, "I wanted people to know when they got tackled who tackled them," you know. And he made that point very clear. So it was great being around those legends, all of them. That's some of the greatest. I wasn't on a lot of great winning teams in the NFL, but I have great memories of playing around some great football players on both those teams.
Conversely, going up against guys, and I put together a quick list of players of your era, whether it's Merlin Olsen, Joe Green, Alan Page, Bob Lilly. We'll mention Jerry Shirk again. But Curly Culp, Bob Baumhauer, just a real good defensive lineman. Does anything stand out for you as to what, maybe not necessarily a technical thing, but was there anything that you noticed amongst the best for guys that, you actually had to physically go against on a down-to-down basis?
Well, Merlin Olsen was, when I was a high school player at John Glenn High School in Norwalk, California, Merlin was already an All-Pro with the Rams. So my second year with the Bears, we're going against the Rams in Soldiers Field. They named me team captain, and Merlin was a captain, and we met out there on the field. And I go, "What am I doing out here? This guy, this guy's a legend, Merlin." And then we squared off, and he would kick your butt, but would be so respectful about it. He'd help you up maybe a little bit or something. But he was probably one of the, if not the smartest defensive tackle I played against all those years, because it was like he was in our huddle. It's like he knew where the play was, and he was a big man, 6'5", 275, something like that, 270, and could run, and he had great balance, and he was very difficult to block, and he had a pretty good day against me that day. And I played against him a couple other times after that, and I did better. But you could tell he was an All-Pro. Now Curly Culp, I played against Curly a couple times, and he was a world champion wrestler too. When he was in college, I think it was Arizona State. And I just, a couple of times, he grabbed my shoulder pads and he threw me like 3 or 4 yards, just like a rag doll. And I'm laying there on my back, and of course he's chasing the quarterback. I go, "Oh man, what am I going to do? With this guy?" But that's how strong he was. And Joe Green, I played against Joe a couple, 2 or 3 times. He was another great defensive tackle. Uh, Louis Kelcher from the San Diego Chargers was a big man, almost 300 pounds, and he was a really good defensive tackle too. So all those guys, you develop techniques to help, minimize what they do best. And I had some great offensive line coaches over the years that helped me when I had to go against guys like that.
And I'd imagine, when Merlin Olsen or Curly Culp just throws you, what's the offensive line coach going to do other than tell you, like, "Yep, that's going to happen from time to time." I mean,
Exactly.
there's going to be times where you lose. So to actually, as we move toward wrapping this up, just to take that that understanding of what happens on a football field and take it back now over to being a counselor. I'm sure there were times where you've seen people take steps forward and then fall backward. What do you do now when you see people fall, particularly when it comes to dealing with addiction or these sort of issues, when there's progress made, but then there's a relapse? Yeah. How do you help uplift them and try to get that internal motivating factor clicking again?
It's another good question. I never make fun of someone that goes out and gets drunk again or gets loaded, because that could be me someday if I don't take care of myself. But we usually try to provide a lot of support and encouragement, and and then we kind of do an assessment of what went wrong. You were doing well. Where did it start going wrong? And then let's look at that piece and let's develop a plan. If you get there again and on this next attempt of sobriety, and relapse prevention now is very prevalent. Most every patient gets a relapse prevention plan when they discharge from treatment nowadays. We've come a long ways in preventing relapse. So a lot of the triggers that cause it and so forth have been identified. So we can work directly with the patient, see where it went wrong. This is what you're going to do next time if you start feeling this way or you start, acting this way, and things are going bad in your life at that time. And this is the plan you need to follow, because life goes on, Steve, in sobriety, and we're going to have good days and we're going to have bad days, and people in recovery need to understand how to have how to deal with bad days through the recovery process. Having friends that are also in recovery, having connection, no, don't isolate, is real important. And so, but we try to help people that come back, and they usually come back pretty beat up. And I tell people too, I go, look, sometimes people relapse, you don't have to, but let me tell you something, when you relapse, you're kind of playing Russian roulette, because you might get back and you might not, and I think that's healthy fear. That's healthy fear for me, that, I'm not going to take that risk, because I might not
Sure.
make it back.
Sure. Sure. As we really get toward wrapping it up, one last football question for you. Just as it relates to some recent news, Josh Gordon is a player, a very well-known player that for years now has really battled some addiction issues. But the more recent news of Henry Ruggs, speeding, obviously drinking and driving. When you see stories like that, I mean, of course, I'm sure you obviously can relate, but I mean, what goes through your mind when you see that there are still young men today that are going through the very same struggle that you walked so many years ago?
Yeah. That's tough, because I feel for those people, because it could have been, by the grace of God, I drove my car many times under the influence, and that could have been me. And so have a lot of uh, sorrow for those players, that get in that kind of, and for the victims too, and but I can relate, and because once you drink to a certain point, your rational thinking goes out the door. Yeah, I can drive, I can drive, and I've been drinking all day. Don't bug me about it, And but it's a tragedy. It's a real tragedy. Now, society's not, back in the 70s and 80s, if you get a DUI, you might get your license suspended a couple of weeks, maybe a month. You have to go to jail for one day. Your insurance goes up. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers changed the laws in America when they they got together, and they developed and they started working with politicians to get a law in there to start making the consequences more severe, because they were losing their children and their spouses, and they were just you know one of the things we would have uh, clients do is go to a MAD meeting and listen to those mothers as part of their treatment, and it was a very powerful experience. So I feel for those guys. uh, I hope they get the appropriate treatment that they need. And I think Josh Gordon is back playing again, isn't he? Is he back out there?
I believe he's on the Chiefs right now.
Yeah. Okay. So hopefully they got a pretty stringent protocol now that that they have to comply with to get back on that field. So that's another example that they have come a long ways, the NFL. But I feel sorry. I feel for those players, and I feel for the families that have been harmed. And I'm just, that could have been me. I tell you, Steve, one of the last things when I was in treatment and I was kind of feeling sorry for myself, how did a good guy like me end up in a place like this, you know? And I was thinking, this could have been so, I could have killed somebody out there driving my car intoxicated. And I still think about that on a regular basis. I'm so grateful that I got help before that happened.
Absolutely. And for all the work that you've done since then too, to help others. So Bob, I want to ask you one last question. It's what I like to end the show on, but before we get there, where can people see what the work that you're doing? Do you mind just talking a little about where you are now? I know that you're on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. If they can send me a private message, I work as an independent counselor and consultant now, and I do a little bit of work at an outpatient facility, a local facility here in the desert. Uh, but uh, if they would like someone to talk to, they can send me a message through LinkedIn. I'm not on Facebook anymore. I used to be on there, uh, but that would probably be the best, and I would get back to them.
There you have it.
The message, and
So there it is. It's LinkedIn.
there you
Well,
go.
Bob, the last question is, and this is what I love to end on. What is the best piece of advice that you would give to a young listener out there on how to live their best life, a successful life?
To live where they're not, where they feel that their values and morals that they have been raised with from their family uh, are not contradicted by their behavior. That's one thing when some people, when they have developed alcohol and other drug problems, they start violating a lot of those behaviors and morals that they grew up with, and and so they're kind of living two different lives. So I would just say follow those values that they have dear to their heart, and 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 hopefully the behavior follows.
There you have it. Bob Newton, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. It was great. Good questions.